I feel myself very much a member of the Iranian diaspora, and proudly so, but I'm also aware that I am just one story in so many stories. I've done long-term ethnographic fieldwork in Toronto, Stockholm, and Los Angeles. My aim in this study is to better understand the experiences of Iranian cultural producers who are navigating shifting political, economic, and cultural realities. And so I chose these sites because we have significant Iranian populations in these cities. They arrived at kind of different points in Iranian history and global history, and they arrived to societies that were receiving them quite differently as well. We have these large Iranian cultural festivals in Toronto. We have a pretty large one in Sweden as well, or several in Sweden. And these are in part funded by the states in which they exist, and exist because these states have multicultural policies. One of the reasons we see this kind of meshing is because the state of Canada, the state of Sweden, encourages that. They want to see this kind of blending, they want to see this kind of work, and so they fund it and they support it, right? In the US, we don't really do that as much, right? And so the kinds of festivals that we have, until quite recently, have been very much community-driven. I don't mean to say that in Sweden and Toronto they weren't community-driven. They were, but they were community partnerships with intermediaries with the state. That's what I mean. Whereas here in the US, I mean community-driven and run and operated and funded and all of that, right? And so what we end up seeing on stage is quite different, right? What kind of audiences end up coming to the events might be also different, and then the long-term outcomes, I argue, are then different. I mentioned neoliberalism as a shift that I'm interested in tracing, but also we can think about the rise of the far right, xenophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiment. So in Sweden in particular, over the last decade or so, we've certainly seen a resurgence of a far right, anti-immigrant, xenophobic party. The third largest party in Swedish parliament today, Sweden Democrats, they are those things. There is a correlation between a shift towards neoliberalism and a reduction in funding for multicultural programming in Sweden, right? And for the kinds of programs immigrants can avail themselves of in an effort to learn language and to become more Swedish, let's say. As well as to introduce their cultures and their lives to Swedes. Right, because the Swedish system had started shifting much more towards interculturalism, thinking about how it's not just a one-way street in which immigrants assimilate into a society, but rather the society itself needs to learn who these immigrants are and incorporate them in a much more fluid relationship. So that's certainly the case that, you know, the rise of this kind of far-right party is correlating with a time in which funding is being reduced for immigrant programs, and sentiment in the public sphere has become much less welcoming, let's say. We think of Sweden in the United States as a very progressive country with a very open immigrant policy, very welcoming to immigrants, and relative to other parts of Europe, that's probably still true. But if we actually look at the history of Sweden and what's happening in the last couple of decades, we can see a shift, just like so many other parts of the West, moving towards a neoliberal approach, both economically and socially and politically, that I think we have to be attentive to. It's important that we kind of challenge some narratives that people have had about us rather than come from us. I also think it's important for us to be able to mobilize in important moments where our communities face challenges, and we live in societies that don't always acknowledge our rights and don't always respect our culture. And studying different communities allows us to see connections in the diaspora, allows us to advocate for our communities, allows us to share best practices with other communities.